Well, good afternoon and welcome to CEDA's Mental Health live stream. Thanks so much for joining us for what I think is no doubt going to be a really engaging and insightful discussion on an issue that is going to be really critical to shaping Australia's social and economic future, particularly in light of our experiences with COVID over the last year and a half. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Melinda Salento. I'm the Chief Executive of CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. You can also see I'm a proud Ndis supporter and have taken the opportunity to fly my scarf, knowing that one of our speakers hasn't packed hers. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm joining you from, the Wurundjeri people of the Colman Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Can I also take the opportunity in acknowledging country and elders to just highlight the importance of this, particularly in the context of today's discussion. Acknowledging country, respecting the important place and position that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities have in our society, and the important place that their tradition and culture holds in this nation is important to building an inclusive society and community, which in turn is important as a foundation for the health, wellbeing and mental health of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. In acknowledging the importance of inclusion and the importance of building respectful relationships and that the role that they play in sustaining mental health, I think it's also important just to call out the flip side of that, which is how corrosive racism is to the wellbeing and mental health of those who are subjected to it, and just call out the role that each and every one of us has to play in stopping racism and calling it out when we see that. This is just one aspect of the broader challenges and priorities that I think our speakers will be traversing today in talking about mental health and what we need to do about it as a nation. And I'm really pleased that CEDA is playing a role in bringing these issues, not just to our members, but to the wider audience and framing up the critical policy priorities that we need to be addressing in this space. While we're bringing this to you as an audience to view and to learn from, we also, of course, want you to participate in the discussion. You can do that by logging on to the Pigeonhole app, either through your live stream page or by typing ceda.pigeonhole.at into your browser. When you do that, type in the password health reform, and then you'll be able to not only put your own questions in, but also vote on the questions that others have asked so that we get a sense of what you're most interested in hearing about. We'd also love for you to jump on social media and try to get this issue trending. If you do, please tag us at CEDA_news, tag me at Melinda Salento, and the hashtag is, of course, mental health. Now, finally, a big thank you and call out to our sponsors, the Nous Group and St John of God Healthcare. Obviously, we can't put these wonderful events on without your support. So thank you so much for your support for today's event, but also for the work of CEDA more broadly. That's probably enough from me. We've got an action-packed hour ahead. Now it's for me to introduce today's moderator, Tim Marney, who is the Chief Economist of the Nous Group, and hand over to him to make a few opening comments. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Melinda, and welcome everyone. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, in my case being the Adjunct people of the Noongar Nation in Western Australia. It's a pleasure to be with you here today on this incredibly important topic, and a very timely topic as well. Let's get stuck into it because I'm looking forward to a really rich discussion. And can I begin then by introducing the Honourable Julian Gillard AC, joining us in her capacity as Chair of Beyond Blue, and of course in her historical capacity as former Prime Minister of Australia. I had the immense privilege of working for Julia as Deputy Chair for Beyond Blue for a number of years. and I can personally attest to her immense passion for improving the mental health of all Australians. And I thank her for her ongoing commitment to that outcome. Of course, today we are talking about mental health reform in its broadest sense, and no better than Ms. Gillard to discuss huge reforms with us, having been the architect of the NDIS, which is probably the boldest social and economic reform that Australia has been through in modern history. So we're immensely privileged to have Julia to speak to us today on mental health reform. And in an environment where the call for reform is pretty much universal. There's universal call for shift in service mix and care and support for people, towards more person-centred holistic care, and also addressing the various determinants of people's mental health, not just clinical treatment, in areas such as housing, education, employment, and so on. All of which in a background of COVID-19, which has exacerbated mental health issues in our communities, and also the backdrop of a workforce that is in short supply and in very high demand, and in many cases fatigued. So I would like to take the opportunity also to thank all those that are working in the mental health space for the incredible work they do. And also I'd like to acknowledge all those people with lived experience of mental health issues and suicidality. So without further hesitation, I hand over to the Honourable Julia Gillard AC.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Tim, for that very, very generous welcome. I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands you are on today, and in a spirit of reconciliation, I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also extend my respects to any First Nations peoples joining this webinar. I'm joining you from London, where I don't have my bulldog scarf, but I've certainly been testing virtual chairing duties for Beyond Blue, starting my work with the Wellcome Trust, which is based here in London, and continuing my work with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. I want to begin by reflecting on the extraordinary times we're all living through. There is not a single Australian who has been left untouched by the challenges of this pandemic. Economically, psychologically and socially, we are being sorely tested as a nation. But we must not lose heart. With vaccination rates increasing rapidly, brighter days are ahead of us. I was personally very relieved to get jabbed, and I'm grateful to the scientists who created the vaccines in record time. Here in the UK, we've seen life return to something resembling normality as vaccinations break the link between infection and serious illness or death. As Australia forges its path towards coexisting safely with COVID, of course there will be challenges, but we also have a chance to use this as an inflection point to shape a stronger nation that prospers by prioritising the mental health and well-being of its people. As the renowned author Arundhati Roy observed, historically pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, ready to imagine another world. Today, I want to talk to you about how Australia can step into that reimagined future. I know that many of you as employers are already doing your own reimagining as you reflect on the impacts of this period of turbulence on your own workforce and your business future. No doubt you are keenly aware that both opportunities and challenges present as you define and measure productivity differently, radically alter thinking about what is a workplace now, and change the nature of the way we work with flexible conditions and enhanced technology. If the new normal is designed with the objective of enabling both better work-life balance and creating a more mentally healthy workplace, then the benefits will be felt for many years to come. In the same way as our nation draws up the blueprints for our post-pandemic future, a key design element must be creating an Australia where we prevent suicide and help all people achieve their best possible mental health. Taking this perspective, it's encouraging to see recent commitments from all governments to implement recommendations of landmark reviews into Australia's mental health and suicide prevention systems. This commitment, along with record budget announcements, is welcome, but it must be delivered with urgency and ambition, and it will need to be enduring. If we are to finally secure wholesale structural reform and build the nation's resilience for future shocks, we must look beyond election cycles and turn words into action. Otherwise, there's a real possibility we will squander this opportunity and nothing will change. Today, I will share with you some of Beyond Blue's perspectives on what we must do differently to prepare the nation for the challenges ahead. Firstly, let me outline the scale of need. Through the pandemic, we've seen people with pre-existing mental health challenges slip further into distress and others struggle for the first time. At Beyond Blue, like so many other organisations, it has been our busiest period on record. Our coronavirus mental wellbeing support service, a Commonwealth-funded, digitally led service, has had more than 1.4 million visitors since launch in April 2020. To September this year, demand for our counselling services is up 53% on 2019. In 2020, demand increased up to 60%. Young people are some of the biggest users of our services. Since the most recent lockdowns, 60% of all contacts have been from people aged 15 to 34. Small business owners, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, older Australians, people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, those with no job, in insecure work and housing, LGBTIQ Australians and others have also struggled. So far, coronial data shows there has been no significant change in suicide rates across the board. That's encouraging, but we can't be complacent. July figures from the National Suicide and Self-Harm Monitoring System show an increase in ambulance attendances for suicidal thoughts and self-harm in both New South Wales and Victoria. We know that mental ill health and suicidality can lead to incalculable social and emotional costs. Life pathways are interrupted, hopes and aspirations put on hold, and plans thrown off course. I was particularly struck by the many personal stories told through the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system. Stories of challenge, resilience and recovery, like Teresa's. The first time Teresa attempted to take her life, she was 15. She had access to mental health services, but never found the combination of support that worked for her. Instead, she learned to cope by pretending everything was okay. Over the years, she was hospitalised for more suicide attempts. She described this as being stuck in a cycle of reaching out for help and being sent back to the same things that hadn't worked in the past. It was easy to build up a mistrust of the mental health system, she said. Despite the efforts of many people who work tirelessly in them, Australia's mental health and suicide prevention systems are not systems at all. They are patchy, piecemeal and crisis-driven, which makes Teresa's story all the more remarkable. I will return to her insights later. Now I turn to the economy and mental health. Every episode of mental ill health can put a dent in a person's unique potential. Left unaddressed, these individual dents also stifle our collective prosperity. The Productivity Commission calculated that mental illness across the Australian economy costs at least $200 billion a year in healthcare costs, lost productivity, economic participation, carers costs, disability and premature death. That equates to more than 1/10 of Australia's entire economic production in 2019, more than $550 million every day. These are pre-COVID estimates. Given the rising distress in the community, costs are likely to be much higher now. It's a toll borne by the whole community, families, health and social services and businesses, small and large. The 2021 Intergenerational Report tells us that to be economically strong and support an ageing population, we must build a high-functioning, diverse and innovative workforce. People who are mentally well are more likely to get a job, stay in a job and perform well in their roles. And a good job provides protective mental health factors through financial security, social connection and purpose. The Productivity Commission sets out the challenge by saying, unless there are successful interventions to address the mental ill health of young people, the overall mental health of the workforce could decline in the future, meaning lower participation, more absences from work, and higher rates of absenteeism. A substantial investment now in proper mental health reform is a critical down payment on Australia's future prosperity and innovation, and a step towards the hopeful future we will get by stepping through that door, through the portal to a more mentally healthy Australia for all of us. With rising need and the full effects of COVID-19 on mental health yet to fully emerge, we must act with urgency. COVID has merely served to amplify pre-existing problems in our mental health system. It's confusing to navigate, fragmented, unbalanced, chronically underfunded, and does not work for the people it's there to support. Too many Australians are told they're either too sick or not sick enough. We know this because we've been told by the people who live it. The latest landmark reports and budget commitments have offered us both the political momentum and the money to get started. The public expect it. Business and industry are behind it. Change is within our grasp if we get the building blocks of reform right from the start. At Beyond Blue, we believe there are several key principles that must inform the road ahead. The first is a whole of government approach. To use the Productivity Commission's language, the back office must be redesigned. And there is much to learn from the lessons gained through the COVID crisis. When the pandemic hit, we saw decisive collaborative efforts from all levels of government to protect Australians. Cumbersome layers of governance were set aside to ensure the rapid flow of money from the Commonwealth to the states or directly into the pockets of businesses, families and individuals in need. Billions of dollars to prevent, test and treat COVID were shared in a new national COVID-19 partnership agreement developed and executed by all governments in days, not the usual months or years. The speed of this deal was enabled by two things. One is obvious, the clear and urgent need to protect Australian lives. The second is less so. There was already a well-designed back office. The back office was Australia's nationally coordinated and funded system for health and hospital care, a system where the roles and responsibilities of all governments are clear, where data and funding flows are agreed and linked to clear objectives, where independent agencies like the National Health Funding Body are charged with improving transparency of public hospital funding, where there is a national system laid out in an agreement between all governments. It can be scaled up and down where and when it is needed. Contrast this with the mental health and suicide prevention system. which has no similar agreement. In her testimony to the Royal Commission, Teresa explained that, in comparison to maintaining my mental health, managing and navigating how to get the care I need to meet my health and wellbeing goals resulting from having diabetes has been much easier. Long wait lists, high out-of-pocket costs, workforce shortages, not knowing where to get help, or not being able to access support early enough to prevent distress from escalating. These issues existed before the pandemic and persist today. A series of pop-up and patchwork solutions in response to lockdowns help to respond to immediate need. But more is required to address the pandemic's long mental health tail. Another area we must prioritise is transparency. We need to be able to see through the cracks to the areas of greatest need. Unlike other areas of health, we have no regulator to robustly monitor and evaluate the mental health system's performance. We collect a lot of activity data, but it's not linked or traced back to shared national outcomes. Beyond Blue believes a key focus must be redesigning the National Mental Health Commission as a standalone statutory body to provide this function. It must be independent, providing frank and fearless advice and regular report cards to governments, ensuring all jurisdictions meet their commitments. Its role and powers should be outlined in the new National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Agreement and linked to agreed outcomes and priorities. The third priority, and the most important of all, is to create a compassionate system that works for and is co-designed by the people who use it. We must harness the wisdom of those living with mental illness and their support networks. They know better than anyone what support they need to survive and thrive. Too often we fail to see the whole person, treating them as a collection of symptoms in need of a quick fix, rather than understanding their unique life circumstances. What has become abundantly clear through the pandemic is the causes of mental ill health are often structural and multifaceted, and our response must reflect that. Secure work, a safe and stable place to call home, food on the table, and meaningful connection are every bit as important as access to services. These social structures are the foundational pillars of mental wellbeing and suicide prevention. When one or more of these pillars is removed, things can quickly fall apart. Reform must centre the experiences of people living with mental illness or suicidal distress and embed consumer and carer voices in governance structures. As Christine Morgan, the National Suicide Prevention Advisor, stressed in her final advice to the Prime Minister, a system that fails to do this is one that is fundamentally flawed. Beyond Blue would like to see the three priorities I've outlined set out in the new National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Agreement, due to be finalised by First Ministers in November. The agreement must establish a more strategic cross-portfolio approach to reform that prioritises prevention, early intervention and recovery, and goes beyond costly clinical and crisis-driven responses. Other critical features include agreed national outcomes that measure things that matter to people, clear roles and responsibilities and agreed priority actions, workforce innovation and diversity. We need to think differently and diversify our workforce, given the long lead time to bring specialist professionals into the system. It needs a long-term spending plan too, with investment jointly planned and rigorously tracked and monitored. We know that Australia, like governments around the world, will emerge from the pandemic with increased debt and competing funding priorities. That's why it's imperative we address mental health reform now, investing wisely in a system which is better designed and consequently uses every dollar more efficiently and effectively. If governments don't start working together differently and co-investing differently now than when. When will we see it? I was heartened to read a statement signed by First Ministers in December 2020 at the National Federation Reform Council that shows our political leaders understand the urgency. They agreed that building a comprehensive, coordinated, consumer-driven and compassionate mental health and suicide prevention system not only benefits individuals, families and communities, but it's also critical for Australia's social and economic recovery and for people like Teresa. She says, "You matter and it can get better. It is worth waking up tomorrow. Whilst it might be hard, keep reaching out. Our system might not be what you need right now, but you deserve a system that responds to you and allows you to reach your human potential. We will only get the system we need if your voice is there to be heard. But governments can't do it alone. To business leaders, I urge you to reflect on your role in being part of the solution. The economic prosperity of your own business and that of the nation will be maximised by getting the national mental health reform settings right. The cost of inaction is borne by business and it is substantial, up to $39 billion a year in lost participation and productivity, coupled with high workers' compensation claims. Improving population mental health is good for Australians, your business, our communities and the national economy. Everyone has a stake in this and stands to benefit from reform. In your discussions with government decision makers, I urge you to emphasise the need for ambitious, wholesale change with a long-term outlook. Our nation needs your enterprise, your influence, your compassion. We need your help. But this has been and will continue to be, this period that we're living through now, one of the most psychologically and bruising periods we have ever faced. The generations in front of us will need more support than ever before. Reimagining and reforming our mental health system is critical to creating a mentally healthy future for Australia. I'm confident we can get there. As a nation, we have faced the greatest adversity, but we have shown that together we can do hard things. If we unite with conviction, clear heads and a collective purpose, we can do it again with mental health reform. Thank you for the opportunity of speaking with you today. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Julia. Laying out a very ambitious target, I think, for the new national agreement. What's your sense of how the national agreement is progressing and the extent to which those three key elements that you outlined will be delivered by the agreement?
Well, we're obviously concerned and understanding in some ways that there's a lot of competing demands for political time and attention right now. Political leaders always have, booming in trays. I've had personal experience of that, Tim, from your days supporting the Western Australian government. You've had experience of that, but obviously with the pandemic, all of that is greatly exacerbated. So we are concerned that whilst there's a will to move towards a national agreement, and we're certainly advocating it's an ambitious one, that it might be not top of mind, which is why we think this is the right moment for advocacy to say we get it, that the pandemic is keeping you incredibly busy, but that this is a key element of pandemic recovery. And so it needs to be done now and it needs your political time and attention now. So, we do think there's momentum. We have seen various statements, and I cited a number of them in the speech, that show a political preparedness for action, but we've got to find the time and space now to close the deal.
Hence your call to action for all of us to advocate for the agreement to meet those requirements. My brief mention of NDIS in the opening remarks has tweaked some interest, and a number of people are very keen to hear what lessons we've learned from NDIS development and implementation that are applicable and we should heed as we embark on, hopefully, historic mental health system reform?
Yes, I think there are some lessons. Obviously, in some ways, it was a different project, but had some similarities. A different project in the sense that we were building from the ground up a whole new approach to supporting Australians with disabilities. And so that's, I think, a bit different from the task that we're engaged in with mental health, where what we're looking at is a long-standing patchwork with many gaps and holes, with much confusion between state and federal responsibilities. What I think is the same is that the NDIS had to be fitted into and work with what was a patchwork that comparable to some of the things we see in mental health, lack of clarity about roles, accountability, caps and queues, things done in one state but not done in another state, people able to access a package of care here, but then it came to an end and there was no seamless transfer to anything else. So the approach the NDIS took, and indeed the healthcare agreements took when we were in government, is really about clarifying roles, responsibilities, accountabilities, putting data at the centre so you know what's going on, and then you can use that data to help you innovate and keep building. So I do think that there are some lessons to be learned. Inevitably, when you conceptualise intellectually a whole new way of working, you get a lot of things right, but you learn things in implementation that you need to rethink. And the NDIS has had some rounds of that. I think an ambitious new national mental health reform agreement would have some rounds of that too. As implementation rolls out, things would be learned. We shouldn't be scared of that. That's a very natural cycle and actually a very productive cycle. So the agreement needs to have in it its own mechanisms for getting the data, responding to the data, and innovating as necessary in the face of the data.
We had a momentary freeze there and lost your last half a dozen words. But I think we got the gist of your response. Sticking with lessons learned, clearly we've learned through COVID that Australians very much care about each other and can pull together incredibly positively as a community. And on the whole, we're incredibly resilient. But that doesn't mean we're all okay, and we've seen that. What should we take forward from the COVID experience, again, to inform the decision-making through the reform process?
I think, well, number one, I think we should take forward, this is not so much to inform the decision-making processes, but to create the right environment for reform. We should take forward with us the preparedness that we've seen during the pandemic to talk about mental health. I mean, one thing that has struck me incredibly strongly is from the very outset of the pandemic, when we were all learning, the terminology COVID-19 and, R rates and all the rest of it, when we were all learning about all of that, right at the outset of the pandemic, people were already talking about the mental health problems that would run alongside the physical and public health challenge that is COVID-19. So the fact that we've been prepared at every stage to talk about mental health, I think is, if we go back 10, 20 years, there's no way that if there was a comparable public health emergency, mental health would have been spotlighted like that. So we need to take that with us and be spotlighting mental health in the recovery. And I think doing that creates the right environment for reform. Number two, I think the preparedness to act with determination and urgently for people to embrace new ways of working quickly that we need to take with us. I mean, a beyond blue example of that is we stood up our coronavirus wellbeing support service 8 days after the Prime Minister announced it. So, we've shown what can be done at the outer edge of urgency and innovation. And I'm not recommending that big reforms be stood up in 8 days as an ongoing pattern of working, but we shouldn't lose that sense of urgency. Then number 3, I think the very technology we're using now, Tim, has been embraced strongly during the pandemic and is the seed of a series of ongoing solutions for healthcare generally, but also for mental health and wellbeing, because we know that one of the big problems is maldistribution of workforce, that the closer you are to the capital city bit of whatever state you live in, the greater your access to services. And as you get to the outer suburbs and then into regional and rural areas, your access to services dramatically decreases. Now, the technology we're using now is not a 100% fix for that, but it can give us some new ways of working which would significantly help with that workforce maldistribution.
Thank you. I really like your observation that during COVID we achieved things we never would have even imagined, let alone thought we could. And that's something for us to all take forward in all forms of what we do. One of the challenges in moving to meet one of your principles, which is around very much person-centred care and support, is the flexibility or lack of flexibility in services to be able to individualise their services and care and support to individuals. How do you think program structures and the system can rise to that challenge of greater flexibility? And secondly, what do you anticipate is needed in terms of workforce strategy to provide the range of skills and supports and allied health and psychosocial supports and even peer support that can deliver that flexible, multidisciplinary mix of care and support?
Yeah. Here, Tim, I think there are some lessons very directly from the NDIS. I mean, the guiding principle of the NDIS is you put the person with the disability at the centre, and then you enable them to customise, to optionalise the things that would support them to get around the life they want to live the way they want to live it. And that, in disability services, that was a revolution, because the approach before that was basically, you've got, you might have a particular form of disability. Okay, well, these are the 2 or 3 things we provide for someone with that kind of disability. And just because, you want to live your life differently from the way that someone way back when imagined a person with that kind of disability would want to live their life, we can't help you. You might want A, B and C, but what we've got on offer is X, Y and Z. So it's X, Y and Z or nothing. And I think all of us know how disempowering that is for the individual at the centre. I mean, all of us want to be the navigators, the decision makers of our own life's journey, to have options and choices. And so why should we think that a person with a disability, doesn't want the same thing? Why shouldn't we think that the person who is in some form of mental health distress doesn't want the same thing either? And I think that recognition that the person has to be at the centre and have options and choices goes beyond the individual and their relationship with mental health services. It goes to the very service design. It's a recognition that the people who are most expert are the people with lived experience. And so I think if we get that principle very clear at the centre, then a lot flows from it. One thing that certainly flows from it is the need for, big innovation in workforce. When we look at the mental health system, people talk about the missing middle. So we have some, first instance services. The Beyond Blue support service is an example of that. But we don't have much that then steps people through if they need more than that kind of very first instance service. And then, we're in the sort of truly clinical end where there are lots of caps and queues. If we're really going to build a stepped care model with no missing middle, that calls for all sorts of innovation in workforce. So peer workers, people with lived mental health experience who can be supports, coaches, and we've shown through our new access model, which under clinical supervision puts someone in contact with a coach who is not a clinician, but can work with them on, support as they get about structuring their lives. They feel like they're getting into mental health distress. It's a sort of preventative program, and the outcomes from the evaluations are very clear that it helps people get back on track with new skills to keep themselves mentally healthy so that they don't tip over into the clinical end. All of those kind of workforce innovations, so the workforce that is not fully clinically registered and at that quality standard, but can make a real difference, that's where we need to see the innovation. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't needs for more clinicians and more credentialed mental health professionals of all sorts. We will need that. We do need that. But the maths clearly doesn't work to say that we've got all of this unmet need and we're going to fill it by generating more clinical workforce. That's not a sustainable model. And then there's also the time delays, which is it takes a long, long time to create a new mental health specialist. That training and education journey is measured in many, many years. And so I think we need to innovate for the long term, but we also need to innovate in the medium term when we're bolstering the supply of clinicians, but we know that that will take some time to achieve.
Thank you. I think with a lot of people in lockdown at the moment, people are slightly living through you vicariously online and through Pigeonhole. They're keen to know what's happening in Europe. A question from Michelle Hutton as to what countries are driving mental health reform well and what can we learn from that?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say I'm the biggest expert on all of that. My observations here, I'm obviously in London in the United Kingdom. My observations here is that the policy dialogue is actually very much the same. You could get out the media sources here and put a little black line through any references to place and then read it, and the policy content wouldn't feel unfamiliar to an Australian if they were reading it. So I think in common is this concern about the pandemic, getting people support during the pandemic, as the pandemic ultimately recedes into the rear vision mirror, what will be, reflected in an ongoing way. And I think the dialogue we've just had about workforce innovation, about the absence of early intervention and prevention, access to those sorts of things, about the real issues being confronted by young people. And whilst obviously many in Australia have been through long lockdowns, the periods of homeschooling that many children have done in the UK and in other parts of Europe are truly staggering. I mean, children who, I've got no friends with children, and it's, the best part of a year that their kids didn't really go to school in any meaningful way. So that's a long, long time. And it's, a long, long time at every stage of development. I mean, you little kids, 2 and 3 year olds that haven't been in playgroups and childcare and all of that sort of stuff, getting the sort of socialisation we'd want at that age, as well as your primary school and your high school kids missing out on both education quality and just the socialisation benefits that come with being with, mobs of people their own age. So, the dialogue here is very much the same. Growing need for new workforce, concerns that traditional health services are under strain, and worries about how government's going to meet all of those needs when it's going to emerge from the pandemic with debt and obviously with fiscal consolidation on its mind.
Thank you. A question from Brett Lightfoot through Pigeonhole, which draws a similarity in terms of the patchwork and fragmentation of service delivery in the mental health space, as well as the sort of fragmented accountability that goes with that. Brett's observation is it's very similar to the challenges in addressing domestic and family abuse and violence. And of course, a lot of people have comorbidities, whether it be mental health, physical health, alcohol and other drug issues. Brett's keen on your thoughts on how we can share the work between these linked challenges and learn from efforts across similar challenges.
Yeah, I think that's a very perceptive question and really takes us to the whole of government approach that I spoke about. And, I know from the inside, whole of government is a commonly used term, but it's really hard to achieve where, the policymakers working on, say, mental health reform scan across government and say, looking at the social determinants of mental health, what else is the government doing that ought to link to the plan? And that could be what is government doing in terms of social housing and to address homelessness, because we know that's part of the social determinants. What is government doing to grow the economy's capacity to offer good jobs, jobs where people can make a reasonable living and have some sense of security about their work, because we know that job loss, financial insecurity is a determinant. And then domestic violence, obviously related to mental health as well. What is government doing to address domestic violence and to enable predominantly women, not always women, but predominantly women, to get out of those situations and to be in safe places and secure accommodation. So I do think that we need government to do that whole of government scanning and to think of the interlinkages. It's hard, and, I don't imagine that we're going to come out of the November discussions between First Ministers with all of that elegantly locked together. We won't. But we do need to come out of it with, clarity about the reform agenda and the key reform steps. And then we can sort of, as we're getting on with that, building a mental health system that works, then this whole of government scanning and interconnections can start to be built too.
I think it's fair to say that the reform agenda is a marathon. It's not a sprint. But keen for your thoughts on what the mental health sector believes should be the first steps in that marathon.
Yeah, I would identify two first steps. One is really a service provision step and the other is an enabling step. The service provision step would be to get on with the task of developing safe spaces with access to peer workers and other forms of support for people who are in suicidal crisis. Now, there's been a step forward on that. There was an agreement, the Commonwealth contributed over $6 million to create the standards that would define what such services should look like, and that's an important starting point. But we desperately need those safe spaces to be available because at the moment, for people who are in suicidal crisis, really the only option is for them to go to emergency departments or to be taken to emergency departments by ambulance officers or by police or by a combination of the two. And emergency departments are, not good environments for people in such suicidal crisis. Now, obviously, if there are physical injuries that need to be addressed, then they may need access to emergency department support. But in terms of the mental health burden, emergency departments are busy, stressed, loud places, and that's not the right environment to start working with people on the mental health issues. So I think that's an important get on with now job. The second thing that I would point to is, as I said in the speech, the building of the National Health Commission and the linking together of the data and the transparency and accountability that the data will bring. If we've got the data linked up and how bad it is transparently staring us all in the face all day, every day, I think that in and of itself will help harness and further the momentum for change.
Thank you. We are at time. So in closing, I will hand to Colman O'Driscoll, who's CEO of St John of God, Burwood and Richmond Hospitals, and Group Lead for Mental Health Strategy. But before I do, we are very lucky to have had you speak today, but we are also incredibly lucky to have a former Prime Minister advocating and working so strongly in the mental health space when you could be doing an array of other things. So on behalf of the Australian community, thank you for your efforts. And over to you, Colin.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Melinda and the CEDA team for putting on the event. I thought giving the vote of thanks and summation was the easy thing to do. But in sitting here and listening to the richness of the discussion, I think Tim has stolen the easy bit of my job, which is to thank you, Julia, for what you're doing in advocating and using the platform that you have to advocate for such an incredibly important public policy area. And so we are very lucky to have you doing that, because I've been in mental health first as a psychiatric nurse and in various other roles for over 25 years. I know I only look about 25, but it's wonderful to finally see that we are getting momentum, that the tide is turning and that it is getting the recognition that it deserves, because this is very much a human problem, not necessarily a health problem. And we need to look at it in that lens. And so thank you for what you're doing. And it will make a big difference, I believe. In summarizing the discussion, I wanted to just maybe quickly touch on some of the things you said in the beginning in relation to the pandemic. And I suppose you can't talk about anything nowadays without first referencing the circumstances in which we find ourselves. But I think what it has done, and some of the commentary related to the system or the lack thereof of a system, is the pandemic has demonstrated by stress testing the system just how fractured it is and how we don't really have a system but a collection of disjointed things. And I think that is fundamentally one of the problems that you've highlighted today. You also highlighted, though, I think that when we do come together to tackle a problem, we're incredibly inventive and we can get things done. And our response to COVID-19 demonstrates that. So if we take that same sense of urgency to tackle the mental health challenge, there's no reason that we can't succeed. But systemic reform is really what we need. I think the other thing that the discussion in relation to COVID and the pandemic highlights is the value and importance of human connection. The thing that we repeatedly hear over and over again is the impact that the disconnection that lockdowns and being unable to be with each other has on people. And so fundamentally, human connection is important to us. And any system needs to recognize that it is about human connection. It isn't necessarily about the clinical things, although, those are important too. And so when we think about building a proper, you mentioned person-centered system that's accountable, I think some of the themes coming through the discussion give us some guidance, I think, in what are important principles for us to bear in mind. And for me, those are things like placing the greatest value on the person's time. I've worked in healthcare 25 years, and I repeatedly see that it is, in some respects, person-centered. It's just that person is the person who works in it, not the person who uses it. And so we build our systems and we design them around those who work in them, not those who use them. So if we can flip that, and Tim, as an economist, you might be able to work this out, but place the greatest value on the person's time, we might get some real transformation happening. And so that was something I think I heard through the discussion. And then I wanted to borrow a little phrase from a colleague in Queensland. When you think about the problem not being necessarily a clinical problem, but a human problem, and that is when we design these systems, if we can think about asking the question, not what's the matter with you, but what matters to you, it can transform the way we think about the problem and how we respond to that problem. Because fundamentally, that is the issue. And I think there are lots of things we discussed today that parallel with how the NDIS is structured, and some of those kind of key principles about the person being in control of their own life and their own destiny. And that would be such a wonderful thing to see in any systemic reform in mental health. And then the last thing I wanted to reflect on was, I suppose, it's important to hold our governments to account. We need to advocate for the kind of policy settings that we want, but we also need to change the world ourselves in the organizations we work in, and in our relationships, and in our families, and in our friendship groups. We have the power ourselves to change the world, not just our governments. And often I think our governments respond to the way in which we're changing our own world. So I think there is a little bit of a call out there for us too, to change things ourselves each and every day, as well as making sure we make it clear to our governments and to our leaders and to our organizational leaders that mental health and well-being and human connection are important to us, because that's the real wealth of any nation, is in its people and in their ability to live full and meaningful lives, because that's what we all want. The case is pretty compelling, and I think you've set it out today as a pretty compelling case. So hopefully, with your advocacy and with the advocacy of lots of other people, we will do in mental health care what we've done in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm delighted to be part of this, and I'm really honoured that you're taking on this as part of your crusade post your time in public life. So thank you, guys, and I'll hand back to Melinda.
Well, thanks, Colman. What a fantastic summation of what's been a really interesting conversation. For my 2 cents worth, I just wanted to join the dots, I think, Colman, to your point at the end there around the responsibility that we have, but also, Julia, just to reflect back on your comment around after crises like we've been through, it is an inflection point, and it's an opportunity for us to think about what really matters. And as an employer, I'm sure like all of you on this live stream, one of the things that we've done more over the last 18 months is think very carefully, first and foremost, about the health and well-being of our employees. And I think that's an opportunity for us to reflect on the fact that that really matters, and we've prioritised that, and how can we prioritise that into the future, and to just listen to Julia's call for advocacy and support, because that's going to make a huge difference in the policy conversations, and quite frankly, the focus of politicians and policymakers. So, perhaps an opportunity for all of us to reflect on what really has mattered to each of us as individuals and employers over the last 18 months. Finally, it's for me just to again thank our sponsors, the Nous Group and St John of God Healthcare. We really appreciate your support. There's always lots going on at CEDA. If you are interested, as you obviously are by showing up today, jump on our website, ceda.com.au, and see what else we're up to. We've done some great work on health, on workforce in human services and aged care, a key theme from today. So check that out. Also on your Pigeonhole app, you can give us some feedback on how you've enjoyed today's event. So look forward to receiving that. Thank you again for your involvement. Thank you to Julia, Colman and Tim. Have a good afternoon and go Ds.